All right. Hello and welcome to the Evergrey and Civic Commons event on building the next chapter of belonging. I'm Caitlin Moran, director of the Evergrey, and joined by some really awesome panelists here tonight, as well as my co-host Frank Nam from Civic Commons. Thanks to everyone who's able to join us on this dark Seattle night, but got a very uplifting conversation today. Looking forward to the next 4 years, a change in administration on the national level, and talking about what that means here locally in Seattle for refugees, immigrants, other marginalized folks. I'll just start off by saying that for those who aren't familiar with the Evergrey, we're a daily email newsletter that helps curious Seattleites make the most of their city. We've actually been around since late October 2016, so launched just a few days before the last presidential election. And I think that really fits into kind of our origin story as a publication. And it was certainly a time of a lot of division in our country and a lot of fear in our community. And I think, we, over the past 4 years, have really jumped on opportunities to bring people together and talk about those divisions and work to move past them. So I'm excited to be here tonight and kind of, look at the next chapter. And if you're not already signed up for the Evergrey, I'll drop a link in the chat so that we can make that happen. And thank you to all our panelists for being here. They're going to introduce themselves shortly. And thanks, as always, to Civic Commons for being a great partner with us. And with that, I'll kick it over to Frank.
Thanks, Caitlin. Evening, everyone. Frank Nam, he, him pronouns, and I work at Civic Commons. I'm the project director for an effort we have called We Belong Here, and it's really focused on how do we create a shared narrative where we realize that we are better together, that we are stronger together, that we are actually connected as people. And if we actually focus in on the relational aspects of our connections to each other before the transactional, we can actually create transformational change. And that's something that we believe in, that we practice, and that's why we love partnering with the Evergrey and working with the readers and the subscribers and the folks in the region. So really excited for tonight and for tonight's panelists. And so I'm gonna have the panelists, Sahar, Kamau, and Rich, all take turns in that order to introduce themselves in any way you want. So describe, your title, where you work, anything you wanna share, but then please answer this check-in question. As you look at the past 4 years, what's an iconic or defining moment for you? It could be personal, it could be professional, totally up to you to decide how you want to answer that. But so think about that for a sec. And then Sahar, whenever you're ready, you can start.
Okay, hi, my name is Sahar. I am the policy director for the Washington State Attorney General's office. I have to give my government spiel and say that whatever I say here doesn't necessarily represent all those lawyers. I am also a lawyer, but I like to say that I quit the law and joined the good side. That's not probably true. You can't really ever quit the law. I worked at the city of Seattle for a few years, King County, so I'm a government bureaucrat by trade. I serve on the OneAmerica Votes Board with Rich, so that is how we know each other. And I've served as adjunct faculty at the University of Washington School of Law. Most of my academic publications are in critical race theory. And I am the mother of a 2-year-old who you will probably hear throughout, so I apologize for that. Most iconic moment in the past 4 years, I toggle back and forth between the Muslim ban and the Iranian Americans who are held at the Blaine border. I am Iranian American, I'm Muslim, the Muslim ban definitely was shocking for me and my family. My whole family is Muslim. It was I think a very profound moment that I think shocked a lot of Americans because they never thought that this could be our country. But I used to run the Middle Eastern Legal Association of Washington and used to run a legal clinic. And I very distinctly remember having my phone blow up for multiple days because people were so scared. I volunteered at the airport at 4 a.m. before work, which is where I used to work with Frank. And I used to do that shift regularly just to talk to folks who were coming in from other countries in Farsi as an attorney. There weren't a lot of Farsi speaking attorneys. And then of course the Iranian border crisis, when that happened at the beginning of this year and all the Iranians were being held, that was another moment where a community was calling at like 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning trying to figure out what was going on. They were scared, and yeah, both really defining for me in the last 4 years. So thanks for that question.
You know, it's interesting that that was one of the moments that came to mind too. I remember when the news came out, one of the leaders on the organization I work for, Washington Census Alliance, Care Washington, was really concerned about that. And it was coming right as our public conversation, and especially civically, because it was such a big election year, but also because it was a census year, was converging. And already there was a kind of palpable sense of, you know, fear, concern, confusion about what the administration was trying to do with some of these most fundamental institutions of our democracy, from the way you know, we count and who counts to the votes and our votes being counted. And so I think for me, you know, one pivot point that comes also had to do with the pandemic. My role at Washington Census Alliance was to direct census outreach for all our member organizations, including OneAmerica and 92 others, tribes, and organizations led by and working in communities of color. And very early in, before we fully got to appreciate how massively disruptive the pandemic would be, was our final time being together in person very early in the year. And it was this culmination of a lot of organizing from communities of color that had pushed the legislature to allocate funding for census outreach, $15 million for people to talk to their friends and communities at a time where social trust is decaying so rapidly, not just with our institutions, but with each other. And we'd come together, and it was that weekend where we found out, you know, the first case in Pierce County. And we knew that this like strategy that we were relying on, which was in-person communications, one-on-ones, to try and inoculate people from misinformation, but also empower them with the tools to make sure that they could share the correct information with their community about the census and other ways to be civically engaged, was going to be just radically different than we had imagined. And looking back, it's really amazing that we were able to pivot so much, and it was still able to be effective. People still had their conversations, but they were like this, virtually, and, you know, small, well-lit corners of our bedrooms. And now Washington State is second in the country in census response, and it's given me a sense that we're kind of at this divergence where there's like everything is up for grabs and things could go incredibly badly, but we could also be incredibly great. And as I've been thinking about, you know, the rapid vaccine coming much sooner, and ways like people have been so filled with ingenuity, it's giving me, you know, cause for optimism for what we can build next year. So that's probably the most impactful moment for me.
And my name is Rich Stolz. I'm the executive director of OneAmerica, which is a statewide organization rooted in immigrant and refugee communities. We do organizing, civic engagement, and advocacy on a range of issues focused on democracy, immigrant rights, and learning. But you know, and my pronouns are he and his, and before coming to OneAmerica, actually working for some national organizations around issues like immigration and economic inequality, and brought a lot of those experiences to what was already a fabulous organization in Washington State that incidentally was founded as a response to the anti-immigrant backlash that followed the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So, I remember how the Trump election in 2016 brought back a lot of the similar feelings of trauma within immigrant and refugee communities. And so it's hard not to think about it as an iconic moment. Trump's announcement around the Muslim ban, which was literally, a day after he was inaugurated. It was very early in his administration, one of the first things he did, and just the chaos that ensued. He made the announcement as a political statement, and then suddenly all these agencies were rushing to catch up, and in communities across the country, agencies and organizations were reacting, trying to figure out, well, what's really happening here. And suddenly there were people being held on airplanes on the basis of their religious identity, or locked in back rooms at airports by Customs and Border Protection, and trying to get to them, making sure that they had access to legal counsel. And the other thing, suddenly thousands of people pouring into SeaTac Airport from every direction. They even had to stop the light, the Port of Seattle actually asked Sound Transit to stop the light rail trains from coming down because too many people were coming into the airport. And there was a massive protest that lasted several days. And when you think about the reaction here and in New York and places across the country, and that definitely comes to mind. This last 4 years has been very much about incidents that sort of shocked the conscience, a response from the community attempting to set things right, and an unresponsive administration hell-bent on telling a certain narrative that much of the country just wasn't willing to go with. And the other iconic moment has to be the George Floyd killing and the protests earlier this year, even with COVID, and a similar pattern of an event shocking the conscience, people turning out, and then suddenly there's a completely other narrative divorced from the reality of people of color being propagated in different corners of the country and right out of the White House.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I believe Caitlin will have some really great questions for our panelists now.
Yeah, I wanted to start off with Sahar because she gave me a really awesome quote in the story I wrote, which was basically saying Trump is one head of Medusa when it comes to the hate and the racist language and rhetoric, and as Rich said, the things that shock the conscious. But obviously, a lot of our issues as a country go much deeper than that. But Sahar also gave me a lot of hope with saying that we can do that work. And a quote that I had from you, Sahar, that didn't make it in the story was, I also think as human beings, we have a lot more in common than we think we do. And I really hope we lean in and that we work together to undo some of this. So I guess I want to start by asking all our panelists, but maybe if you want to jump in first, Sahar, just how do you see us approaching that work in the next 4 years or even the next few months? How do we start?
Yeah, and this is fitting because Rich is actually one of the many people I look up to in life. And so it's fitting that I'm going to start answering this with a quote that Rich just said around the narrative being divorced from BIPOC and sort of seeking to shift narrative. I think that is maybe the first step that anybody can really take, right? Lifting up communities of color and their voices, making sure that we're centering work around those voices. I think that is a lot of what both of the other panelists do in their day-to-day. And centering work in that way. And that means, everything from, hi, Samuel, anything from people who are running for office, people who are making policy change, people who are making legislative change, right? The people who have those power dynamics and shifting those power dynamics. And a lot of what I think that means, so a few things. One, I would say, I am optimistic, and I know like we run a lot of trainings and things, and people, like, especially in the last couple of years, have come very depressed, and they are like, there's no way to solve this, and there's no end, and it's over. The world is awful, and that's fair, and you should, feel what you want to feel in the moment. But I do believe that we can undo racism in our lifetimes. I do believe that if we all focus and work together towards a common goal, that we can recognize and name it and say it, particularly like looking at folks like me in bureaucracy who lift up racist sort of institutions in many ways, because they're sort of created, government is created by white folks for white folks. Shifting those power dynamics, giving folks of color that voice that they should have always had back, right? And I always say, I hate the word empower because sort of presumes that folks of color don't already have that power. And so I don't love it when government says, we want to empower communities of color. What I would prefer to say is we want to give them back their power that we took. And I think if we organize around that narrative, if we lean in together, if we practice grace with each other and recognize that we're not going to get it right immediately, there are all kinds of things that we could be doing differently, right? We can lift up communities of color in those places where we have power and make sure that they are leading with their voices, and that we're backing off and staying away, right? And a lot of what, if we're going to focus on bureaucracy as a case study, which is sort of, unfortunately my bread and butter, a lot of what we've done, in bureaucracy is think about sort of racial impact statements and racial equity toolkits, and how do we bring community into government and use the tools that we have to sort of analyze with data, analyze with community, qualitative and quantitative, lift up that qualitative data from community and say, these are sort of the harms and that could come from these policies that could disproportionately impact communities of color, disproportionately impact BIPOC. And then work to give community the resources they need to do the work that they're doing, right? And that is, in some ways it seems very simple, but I think consistently pushing on your electeds, pushing on folks who have that power right now to sort of release some of it is in many ways a lot of the key, at least in the space that I am in now.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I guess anyone feel free to jump in, but I know Kamau with Washington Census Alliance, as you alluded to earlier, you're doing a lot of work with relational organizing, and I'm curious how you might see that fitting into, undoing some of the systemic injustices that we know will continue after Inauguration Day.
Yeah, this is probably the biggest challenge that's, not just for the next year, the next 4 years, but that is so clearly the challenge of our generation is we are already a very multiracial public, but we still live with the institutions that were made both in a compromise with slavery and to advance, native erasure physically and in our public stories from this land. And we still have those institutions, and we see them at work all the time, pulling us back, kind of like, like it's like a hand from like history, like reaching back and exercising its power. And many people have seen that, kind of work as well in the Electoral College. This is an election where the margin in the Electoral College, the votes that would have swung different states, is smaller. It's 65,000 votes going a different way, gives us a different outcome. We are going to be something that was so important to us in the census was portraying an accurate depiction of the multiracial public that we are, because that's another institution that's trying to be used to prevent the multiracial majority of this country from being represented in the seats of power and being able to share in the prosperity that we've all built. This is a country that's going to be majority non-white in 2045 around, but we're not going to have majority non-white institutions. That's to say the majority of states that elect the senators, that select the courts, that then make up the electoral college in part with the apportionment. That's not going to happen until 2090. The majority of states won't be non-white until 2090. And so we have this real problem where we are on track to have a multiracial majority being ruled over by white dominant institutions. And that's not to say, them like literally the people who make them up and have interests that don't want people to have power, much less to be even counted and seen as a part of the country. And so something that I think you're going to see is the Northwest, particularly in Seattle and Washington State, has an opportunity to be a model, sort of like a positive, case study of what it means to live in community. People have, the kind of belonging that Frank talks a lot about, and what a multiracial democracy looks like. It's going to take big structural changes of the way we elect our leaders. These winner takes all elections, and many people are going to watch this, happen in local elections next year, is that you can't have multiple people appealing to the same communities, and that's disastrous for communities of color. And Rich is able to talk a lot of about this with the Voting Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act enforcement that they've been working on. Our system isn't set up for communities of color to be represented in these halls of power, and it's not an accident. And I think you're going to see more pushes to, draw fair districts in 2021, to have new forms of electing people like race-based voting and lifting the racist ban on race-based voting that we have in Washington State, to rethink what our districts look like and what it might look like to have multiple members representing the same district, understanding that a place is much more diverse than the one person that's able to cobble together a 50+1 coalition. And that's part of the work that we're interested in, is getting to the root of what made the census such a crisis, what makes us so vulnerable to this kind of institutional hacking that we're seeing, and how we can, build up resiliency towards that. And it's part of what makes me excited about the future and our ability to lead here in Washington State.
Awesome, thanks. And Rich, he basically teed you up there. So you want to chime in?
Sure. I mean, a couple of things do come to mind. And one thing that, was exciting about this last election was just the number of people who voted, and, and the number of people of color who voted, which was a change, across the board. And that was like very exciting, because it's too often the case that, some people are voting and making decisions to elect folks that are representing so many folks that, can't vote or chose not to vote. If you look at our school system, like here in Seattle even, or just in South King County, there are districts who are, 30, the kids are probably 30% immigrant, learning languages, in some cases more. It may be that 50% of the students and their parents can't vote. And the people electing the folks on the school district live a completely different life than the folks who are actually attending those schools, but they're the ones making the decisions about, how those kids are taught, what they learn, who their teachers are, on and on and on. And so that's just a clear example. And, one of the things we would love to see someday would be non-citizen voting, particularly in like local elections. So I'll just put that out there as a marker. One thing we have succeeded in doing is passing here in Washington State something called the Washington Voting Rights Act. And other states are now looking at doing something similar, but it's exciting because it's creating a mechanism to to hold systems accountable for election policies and methods that have disproportionately disenfranchised people of color. And we're in the middle of a lawsuit right now in Yakima County, challenging their system of elections, because the way it works, it's majority rule in every instance. And while they have districts on paper, they don't actually use the districts. And so everyone in the county ends up voting for the people to serve on county commission. And as a result, there's never been a Latino elected, even though the number of Latinos in that county is close to 40–50%. So those are examples. And how organizations like ours and the Census Alliance and others across Washington State are really pushing the envelope of what's possible. It always goes back to who votes, though. And the other side of the equation, when you think back to the original question, Trump being sort of one of the snakeheads of many, it's a very colorful expression. I don't like to think of like all the people that voted for Trump as snakeheads, but we got to remember that in this last election, a lot of people, like more people voted for Trump as an incumbent than I think in just about any prior election. Just the fact that so many people voted overall was such a big deal. And there were a lot of people who voted for Trump because, there is, call it narrative, call it whatever it may be. A lot of folks aren't comfortable with the way this country is changing. A lot of folks are more comfortable going back to a world in which they felt like they belonged more than they do now. And I think this conversation of belonging is a really important one, because right now we're in this battle about who belongs to what vision of our country or our society. And there are ways of breaking through that, but as long as there are politicians like Trump or others that are exploiting the differences to try to gain power, so much of us end up falling into these traps where we're pitted against each other on the basis of who belongs more. And and that's not the fight we want to be in. The fight we want to be in is a conversation about how do we even the playing field for elections, so that the people we elect are actually representative of all of our communities. And we're having serious debates about what history and inequality and inequity really are, and how we as a nation can challenge ourselves to be, the country we could be, where we actually value equality and equity and justice for all. And I think that's the fight that, we're in the midst of. And the other side will paint that in a completely different picture, but we got to be true to like a sense of values that go beyond, what some folks may believe and what we believe. Like we have to go back to some of these fundamental values around justice and equality, and fight from there.
Oh, thanks so much, Rich. I think a lot about, really quickly, like the idea of how policies are really protective measures, and they create safeguards, and they create more equitable opportunities. But you can't create a law that makes people look at each other as fully human, right? Like that's a personal decision. So the idea of changing the narrative, I think, is so important. Being mindful of time, actually, we're going to skip ahead to the question which we posed to the panelists ahead of time, which is, thinking about the people that are dialing in right now and listening to this conversation, the people that will download this and watch it later on, what can people do? What can the average person do to help make this region more inclusive, more welcoming? Something that you believe is a good actual real step as we enter into 2021 and beyond. Like, what can people do to create the space where we have better policies, but also where we actually humanize each other a little bit more? What's something people can do? So, Rich, why don't you start? Since you kind of ended the last thing, I would love to see you take what you said and tie it together.
It's so important for all of us to call. I think we're streaming, so I think I can say things like, try not to swear. So you gotta call things out for what they are. If something's racist, you have to be comfortable calling it racist, or at least say that doesn't sound right, that doesn't feel. The more that happens, the more we take power away from folks who are comfortable the way things are. If it looks like somebody's being marginalized because they're a woman, or because of their gender identity, or because of their race, call it out. And folks have to be comfortable doing that. White folks have to be comfortable doing that too, because that's all pieces in this bigger narrative that is being fought across this country around who belongs. And as long as folks are comfortable living the way they are without having to think about the consequences of their behaviors, the harder it will be for marginalized people to create the space they need to grow. And that's fundamental to all this other stuff. In addition to that, vote, get informed, look into these issues, participate and volunteer for organizations like those represented on this call, candidates of color who are, doing everything they can to crack these ceilings, but also change the cultures of these political parties. There's a lot that we all can do, but it requires us to actually feel and to demonstrate our own investment in the communities we're living.
One thing I really enjoyed, Rich, is watching the number of friends who started phone banking and text banking for different candidates. And I think the cool thing about that is voting, is exercising your right, your individual right, but having a conversation via phone or via text with someone and trying to tell them about a candidate or a policy, just piece of legislation, creates a conversational aspect with you and someone else. I really enjoyed that, watching so many people take part in our democracy that way, which is really cool.
It is really
Kamau,
cool. Let me just add
right?
to that.
Please go ahead.
This year we did something different because we've always called people in the traditional approaches. You call the folks you're pretty sure are going to vote the way you want them to vote and remind them to vote. Very transactional calls. But this time around, we actually did what's called deep canvassing. And the idea there is you're calling folks you're not actually sure how they're going to vote. You may know a little bit about them, but the idea is to actually ask questions and engage them in a conversation about why it's so important to vote, and let them know who you're supporting, but you're not assuming any particular thing. But by the time the conversation's over, and this may end up being a 5-minute conversation, there's one conversation that lasted 40 minutes, I know of. By the time it's over, it's the question then is are they going to vote? And if yes, who do they think they're going to vote for? And you've connected in a way that you hadn't before to somebody who, you want to do more than just have a transaction with. And so more and more folks are doing this. And a lot of us learned this from the LGBTQ community in the campaigns for marriage equality, where it was more than just asking the people, you couldn't win by just asking folks who you thought would vote for your cause to vote. You needed to go broader. And I think it's a promising element, right? Where we're not just talking to the folks who are guaranteed to do what we hope they'll do. We're actually talking to folks who we want to connect with and change hearts and minds.
I want to just, Rich, what you were just talking about reminded me that when I was volunteering at CTAC, right during the Muslim ban, a lot of people who came up to me were also self-proclaimed Republicans, and it was 4 a.m. so I was not very awake, but awake enough. And many people just wanted to talk about the Muslim ban. They didn't understand it. They didn't know what that meant. They wanted to know where my family came from. They wanted to know about Iran. Most of my family lives in Iran. And many people walked away saying, I don't think I agree with it either. Thanks for the talk. A lot of people get so anxious when they talk to me about this that I feel like I can't have an honest conversation. And I just want to be clear that my calmness was because I was so tired, but that it worked, it worked well. And the other thing that sort of floats through my head while you were talking, so, not so fun fact, but I guess fun fact, I ran for office many years ago in a very white-ish district. And I actually don't think this district has ever had a person of color elected. And I haven't looked it up. I was just thinking about that as you were talking. I don't know that I lived here 15 years and I haven't seen one, but maybe a long time ago. And I wanted to talk about racism, and Rich remembers because OneAmerica Votes endorsed me at the time. And many people slammed the door in my face and said, you want to talk about racism, go get your votes from the people who would benefit from that. And it, not a great thing to hear about on the doors. And this was 8 years ago. And I guess what I would say is what is giving me hope is that so many people in this district are now talking to me about race, right? Like people who I think who want to lean in, who want to have that grace, who want to have that conversation that Rich is talking about that is so important to sort of engage in those tough conversations. And I think people are when I was talking about the many different heads of racism, and I said, getting rid of Trump is just one component of it. There is something to be said for the fact that what Trump did was force us to talk about race, right? He forced this conversation, in some ways, a really uncomfortable, brutal conversation that we have all been sort of hoping would not show up at our Thanksgiving dinners and whatever. But he also sort of forced, a number of folks to be louder. And, as a woman of color, I was just thinking as a woman of color at work, sort of what are the things that helped me when I got this question. And the things that make the biggest difference to me are when I talk about something and somebody comes up to me afterwards, or somebody defends me in the meeting and lifts up what I said. Those are the things that I hold. Those are the things that, if you want to do something little throughout the day, or if you just want to make that small change, being an ally in that space in that way makes a huge difference to those of us who are people of color, especially if we're one of one in the whole agency. So I just wanted to add some of the things going through my head.
Wow, that I did remember now a little flashback from the campaign. I think that's super impactful. What you all are sharing is, if you're, in my view, the things that folks in this call can do is really make a plan. You don't have to do everything, but if you can understand that if you're the type of person to log on to a webinar with a niche publication and civic engagement nonprofits, you are the person that needs to take all the great ideas and insights you have and share them out. And it might not always be, feel like it's really heroic, but people do change their minds, and more people are persuaded than you would think. So if you're the kind of person who is listening to this, and you have the opportunity of making a plan to write a letter to the editor to the Seattle Times and talk about, for example, I'll mention 2021 is going to be a redistricting year. And so often you'll hear a lot of rhetoric about it's bipartisan and they have appointees, but that makes it a partisan process where a lot of times communities of color are left out. And if you're, the type of person who logs onto this and you dig in a little bit and you find out, oh, the districts often disrespect Native boundaries by, putting half of a reservation on one district, half another, and diluting the Native vote. You're the kind of person that should be speaking up about that and kind of calling it out to the people who are most engaged but don't know or don't hear it from a validator like you. If you're the kind of person on this call and you're able to do a little digging and find out that they, drew like the 15th legislative district and called it a majority minority district because that's the population, but it's an electorate that's 60% white and regularly sends one of the most racist legislators to Olympia, Jim Honeyford, that's something that you're probably in a position to speak up about and change a few minds in your own circles and, make sure that the districts, which are the structures that we're talking about, change in a way that reflect the values of equity you probably have showing up to a call like this, and then do that for ranked choice voting or for the other structural changes in our economy, for the ways that we've divested from communities, working class communities of color in particular, and just kind of taking responsibility for the fact that you are one of the best positioned people to push this change to the folks that trust you the most. So that's my advice.
Wonderful. No, thank you. This is great advice. And we will be following up, I believe, with some links and a resource toolkit for y'all to look into. And some of the links and the websites and organizations that our panelists mentioned will be shared with the audience. We do have a couple of questions, one in the chat and one in the Q&A tools. So maybe Sahar, if you want to answer the question from Alexandria or start with that one, that'd be great.
From Alexandria, the question about Northeast Seattle Community Garden
Yep.
and over 55, correct? Okay, good. There's a lot of questions popping up.
Yeah, totally.
All right. You know what, Alexandria, I was just thinking about this. Have you ever heard, well, I guess this is not like a back and forth, but one thing you might think about, I'm like ready to get into it, community chat. One thing that I was just thinking about for you is CARW, the Coalition of Anti-Racist Whites. I don't know if you've ever organized with them, but they're a great resource. And I often refer white folks who are practicing allyship to them. I think they do a lot of trainings in the community. They have a lot of great tools around white allyship. So that might be a place to start if you're looking for very specific resources. I don't know if other folks have answers there. That just means I answered it really well.
I think they're a great resource and organization. I think the other thing I would just say is don't be discouraged. When that situation arises and there's pushback, expect that there will be pushback. I think it's courageous to start a conversation that folks aren't necessarily comfortable having. Know that the experience you're having is being felt, a couple times multiplied by Black activists calling for Seattle Police Department to be defunded, and everything they're doing is being analyzed every which direction. I think it's important to have these conversations, and the next time conversation happens, hopefully folks will be more open to it. Or you'll be attracting folks who are finally ready to have that conversation.
No, thank you, Rich, and thank you, Sahar. And I said in +1 for CARW, great resources there. There's another question around that I'll read to the audience. We have had a homeless emergency declared since 2015. And for many, the problem seems almost too big to have any meaningful impact as one individual. What would you say to these people who may be inactive due to the fear of doing the wrong thing? And I think it's almost like two questions, right? Because there's questions specifically around homelessness and what can people do because it's such a large problem, but also this idea of like fear, like a paralyzing fear of like if I do something and I do it the wrong way, or if I didn't, if I say something that maybe I didn't realize is going to be offensive to someone else, or I didn't take into account of something else, like this like paralyzing fear of like doing something because they may do the wrong thing. If feel free to answer one or both of those questions to the panelists, whoever wants to jump in.
So I'll start. In a past life, was a homelessness staffer, so I will take a shot at this. What I think for homelessness in particular, and the programs that I have found that seem to work the best and resonate the best are the ones that are developed with folks who are homeless making decisions, right? Looking at the unhoused community, lifting them up and asking what they need, instead of a whole bunch of people who haven't really been a part of that conversation or been with those community members to date. And so I think, many years ago, I worked on the vehicular residence program for the city of Seattle, and I doorbelled on 800 mobile homes in sort of the Ballard area and asked them, what do you need right now? What's working and what's not working? And, in that particular instance, a lot of what wasn't working was the city's no parking rules and the issues around scofflaw and things like that. And people were getting towed and getting parking tickets, and then they were getting impounded, and they, a few more tickets out, and they were getting a warrant for their arrest, right? And sort of shuffling them into the public safety system. And so the other thing that I often say around homelessness is to think about it not just as one small sliver, but that it really is part of a system. And to folks who think, oh my God, that's overwhelming, and I don't know if I'm going to talk about the wrong thing, I always say I'd much rather have somebody say, look, I don't know if this is the right question, but I'm going to ask, and sort of lean into that conversation than have a whole bunch of assumptions being made that aren't addressed or talked about, and then people are just continuing down that pathway, right? Like, I don't know. I'd love to hear what other folks think on this panel, but in my world, I'm like, I'm not going to judge you if and take it out of homelessness and maybe just in the context of being Muslim. Like, people come up to me all the time and ask questions, and I much prefer to be asked a question, in good faith, and have someone genuinely trying to understand than to have someone make some assumption about my people or where I came from in the course of a conversation that just doesn't make me feel seen or heard.
Kamau or Rich, do either of you want to respond to that question or questions? Totally okay if you don't too. We can see if another question pops up.
Come on, I was actually hoping you would answer.
Yeah, I'd say maybe Rich feels to you whenever there's these kind of like really big problems, and you have that feeling that Frank was describing of not wanting to do the wrong thing. Like making a commitment from the long term could probably do a lot of benefit. It works well that way. It's kind of like interest compounding, where if you're committed to one or two things and you have confidence in your neighbors and other people, like on this call, doing their part on other issues, if you commit to that for doing like that, a few things a year over 10 years, you're going to end up with making a really big impact than a sort of like New Year resolution approach of going hard like the first 3 weeks and then puttering out. And I'd say, they're tough for a reason, and they're around for a reason. So it's not something to take personally, but something to kind of think, okay, like, where am I best positioned to make an impact? How can I commit to that over the long term? And then trust that other people will carry the other places or the other issues that you also care about. Rich, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, uh, it can be easy to find yourself in that place where the problems of the world are so overwhelming, and they're all connected to each other. It's kind of like I think it sometimes is helpful to think about a metaphor like a blanket that kind of just needs to be taken apart. The only way to take one apart is you just need to start pulling out one thread at a time, right? It's like you're not responsible for everything, but if you care about something, you're gonna you're fulfilling a piece of yourself as a person by taking some action. And you're the other thing that's interesting is people too often want to defer to the experts, and part of what we always do, it goes back to what Sahar said. It's like those most impacted should have a pretty significant role in determining the solution to the problem. And sometimes it's important because you have to figure out what problem you're trying to solve for. And the conversation could go in a direction maybe you weren't anticipating. But if you're not doing anything and just leaving it to other folks to make those decisions because you're afraid of saying something wrong, that's a way of absolving yourself of responsibility as well. If you feel a tug, let yourself get tugged and get involved, and that's a starting point. And it is important to go into a situation assuming you may not know the right answer, but you want to figure out what it is.
Yeah, I'm also reminded of a story I wrote last fall, actually answering a very similar reader question, how to most effectively help our homeless neighbors. And it does feel overwhelming for a lot of folks. But one person I talked to at a cool local organization called Facing Homelessness said you have to start by looking at what you're passionate about and what you're good at. So I think that also relates to addressing systemic racism and other injustices is, looking inward and what are the talents you can bring to the table. And, whether that's going down to CTAC at 4 a.m. to volunteer legal advice or getting involved with your neighbors in some other way. I think we all have something to bring to the table. So.
Yeah, one thing I want to say is that the work that we do at Civic Commons around belonging is really foundationally based upon the work of an amazing person named John A. Powell at the Othering and Belonging Institute out of Berkeley. And something that John says a lot is the idea of enlarging your circle of human concern, which is the idea is the people that you care about usually is the people that you live with, your family, your loved ones, maybe a strong group of friends. But once you have that safety and security of loved ones, how do you build that circle out to involve your neighbors or to involve the other parents at your school or to involve your colleagues at work that maybe you don't speak with? And we all have such different lived experiences and backgrounds, and the ability or the unlocking the curiosity that we have about others is such an important part of our ability to move on from this point in our lives where these problems seem so big and unsurmountable. There isn't going to be even the greatest philanthropists, and not the greatest in the sense of their greatness, but just amount of money they have. Money doesn't make problems just go away. They help a lot, right? And they really do create resources, and we need the resources of those with money to help. But it's just really the activation of your human connection to other people and realizing that all these problems are connected, and there isn't one way to just solve all of them at once. But the changing the narrative that we're actually better together and stronger together, and that we can do things better and smarter and faster and more sustainably. And when we see the humanity in others, I think is something that we are trying to change the narrative of, and I think that's what I think we're all trying to do. So yeah, so that, or we can just, try to get our good friends who are just wonderful to run for public office. That's also another way to do it. That's something that we're seeing in the panelists chat. But yeah, so I just wanted to end my part there. But yeah, Caitlin, what else is what's next?
I mean, I think all of that is great, and we could end it right there if there aren't any other questions. But want to give folks one more chance to chime in, and I guess maybe panelists, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to tack on there?
I'm amused by the chat. I think maybe by the end of this, Sahar will be running for office again.
Anyway, what I would say, this is what Rich does, like anytime I'm in a room with him, what I would say is, to that point of resources for women running for office, the one thing that I didn't say, and that I should have said, is that sort of to the point of, if you are watching this, you're probably a very specific kind of person. You should probably be considering running for office yourself, in all kinds of different ways, right? It doesn't have to be Congress. It could be school districts, right? It could be school board. There's so many places that you could make a difference, particularly if this is the kind of thing that, these are sort of the progressive policies that you're interested in. These are the voices and spaces that we want to see all of you. And Rich and OneAmerica Votes, they do a lot of great work around organizing for particularly BIPOC to run for office. So those are the last words I will say.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, one of the biggest motivations for people when they were considering, they had worries or confusion around the census, where they want to see representation for their communities. And next year, I mentioned there's redistricting, but there's also local elections that don't get enough attention. And one of the positive things, to something that Rich mentioned earlier, is this summer's focus on what's happening in our cities, locally, the police budgets. That's such an encouraging development that we are now putting a critical eye to where government is closest to us. And for the people on this call, either yourself, think about who represents you on county commissions that oversee the sheriff's office, that oversee public services that go towards addressing homelessness. We live in a state that prior to this election, if you looked at county councils and county commissions, you could count the people of color on one hand out of over 130 positions. We live in a state where out of the top 20 cities by population, 6 have all white city councils, including places like Vancouver. It's like the 4th largest city in the state. And we know we got, we got some brothers and some friends in Vancouver. So, even if you yourself, that's not your role, think about where you can pitch in, and those kinds of places to volunteer and do deep canvassing or contribute are places where they can go the farthest. And then, you have a good conversation starter for next time you're talking with friends about what you're up to, and you can let them know about these things and the ways that you're pitching in. And that's kind of what sets off a, really positive cycle of people being involved. And that's something I'd love for people to see and consider and do.
I just really love this panel, and thank you, Frank, for bringing John Powell into the conversation and the wonderful work that he's doing. And had the chance to meet him, and there's something about him that I think is just very special. And Caitlin, thank you for helping to bring us together.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks to all our panelists for being here, Sahar, Kamau, and Rich, and of course, Frank for co-hosting, and Civic Commons for helping make it all possible.